The date, July 17th, 1918. The place, Ipatiev House, Ekaterinburg, Russia. In the early hours of that fated day, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Tsarina Alexandra, their 5 children, and their servants were awoken and brought down 23 steps to a small, dark cellar in the house they were imprisoned in after the Tsar had abdicated his throne a year earlier. They were then executed by a firing squad of Bolsheviks, orders that were believed to have come straight from Vladimir Lenin himself, putting a permanent end to the 300-year reign of the House of Romanov. The details of that night and the subsequent fate of the royal family became one of the most famous cold cases in history. The Bolshevik government began spreading disinformation about whether they had killed the entire family. The mystery behind it all and the absence of any physical evidence to confirm their deaths led to the true facts becoming obscured within conspiracy theories and many imposters claiming to have survived the execution and be the long-lost Romanov children, in particular Anastasia and Alexei. For years, people believed, hoped that some of the family might have survived the massacre that took place. To this day, a number of people still falsely claim to be descendants of the Romanov family. But thanks to a series of archaeological discoveries throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the truth about that fateful night in July has finally come to light. This is the story about how archaeology helped solve the mystery of the Romanovs. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated his throne after the February Revolution that led to the establishment of the Russian provincial government before Lenin and the Bolsheviks took complete control after the October Revolution that same year. After his abdication, the next year and a half was filled with uncertainty for the royal family. They were first moved to Alexandra Palace near the Russian capital of Petrograd, where the family expected to live in internal exile. Unfortunately, this was not to be the case. As much as the provisional government wanted to protect the family and keep them alive and in a comfortable exile within the country, there was great worry that the existence of the Romanovs in Russia would stir a counter-revolution. Not to mention that there was also the issue of the provisional government having to maintain its relationship with the soldiers of the Petrograd Soviet, a radical political organization that was demanding essentially the execution of the Tsar and his immediate family. Some members of the Imperial Family were eventually able to leave Russia, but Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei were sent into exile in the Siberian town of Tobolsk in August 1917, and then, after the Bolsheviks ousted the provisional government in the October Revolution of 1917, the Romanovs were moved to the Russian town of Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains and placed in Ipatiev House on April 30th, 1918. Little did they know that this would be where they would meet their end, not even 80 days later. Before these final moves, there were indeed some attempts at saving the Romanovs and getting them out of Russia. The foreign minister of the provisional government first pressed the British government to offer them asylum. Tsar Nicholas II and King George V of England were actually first cousins. Their mothers were sisters. They also had a good political relationship before World War I began. Given this, it would seem like sanctuary would be an easy yes, but the offer of asylum came begrudgingly, and was specifically only for the duration of the war. This offer was fraught, to say the least, and quickly rescinded. You see, it was a very tense time politically. By 1917, with the war entering its 4th year and the Russian revolutions causing concerns regarding keeping them fighting in the war effort, especially when the Bolsheviks wanted a separate peace agreement with Germany, getting the Imperial Family out of Russia was a bit lower on the priority list. George V also worried that bringing the controversial Tsar and Tsarina to England might cause unrest in the working classes who sympathized with the Russian revolutionaries. George might have wanted to help his cousin, but with tensions rising, increasing anti-German sentiment, Tsarina Alexandra was German-born, don't forget, and the fear of losing his own throne, the offer of asylum for the Romanovs was withdrawn within weeks. George V wasn't the only royal with these sentiments. According to research done by Dr. Helen Rappaport, many of the Romanovs' European relatives believed that the downfall of Nicholas and Alexandra was entirely their own doing, and that it had endangered the thrones of royal families across the continent. Alternative places were sought for potential refuge. Denmark, who was neutral in the war, was too close to Germany. Norway and Sweden offered to help with evacuating the Romanovs, but refused to house them. France and Switzerland both refused. It seems the Imperial Family was the Grinch, and no one wanted to touch them with a 10-foot pole. There was, however, one exception. King Alfonso of Spain was the only royal relative who made efforts on behalf of the family from the date of their abdication right up until they were murdered in July 1918. Unfortunately, Alfonso's efforts were in vain. Once the Romanovs were moved to western Siberia, first to Tobolsk in August 1917, and then to Ekaterinburg in April 1918, they were too deep into Russia to get out logistically. And once they were out of sight in the foothills of the Ural Mountains, they were out of mind. This led to a complacency about the safety of the Romanovs, and the need to get them out was forgotten in favor of focusing on the war. This complacency, though, proved fatal. Trapped in Lenin's new Soviet state, the royal family spent their final months residing in Ipatiev House, a wealthy merchant's house in Ekaterinburg. This was, of course, to keep them out of the public eye, to ensure no monarchists could rally and help them regain power. While they were permitted daily exercise outside in the enclosed garden, the windows to their rooms were painted over and a high wooden fence was built around the perimeter, isolating the Romanovs and closing off any access from the street. Less than 3 months after this move, without any due process of law or trial, and no mercy towards the 5 children of the former Tsar, the Imperial Family of Russia was brutally slaughtered in the name of the revolution. At 1:30 in the morning on the 17th of July, 1918, the family was woken up by guards in the house and were instructed to get dressed and pack. They were told that the anti-Bolshevik White Army forces of Tsarist and moderate democratic socialists were nearing the city and that there had been firing in the streets. This was a very convincing cover story, as the Bolsheviks would have needed to keep the imperial family out of their pro-monarchy hands. The White Army was indeed on the move and gaining ground, so it wasn't a complete total lie. According to Commander Yakov Yurovsky, who had taken over their guard, at 2:15 a.m., the family, along with their court physician Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, chambermaid Anna Demidova, cook Ivan Kharitonov, and valet Alexei Trupp, were brought into the cellar at the back of the house and were told to wait there until transportation arrived. Chairs were brought at the request for Tsarina Alexandra and their youngest child Alexei, who was quite sick with hemophilia. Nicholas, who was carrying his son, set Alexei down and stood in front of him as if to shield him. The rest stood behind the chairs and against the back wall. They were completely calm, unsuspicious as to what was about to happen next. The group was then left alone for some time, and after a while, Yurovsky led his team through the double doors into the room and ordered everyone to stand. Reading from a scrap piece of paper, Yurovsky stated that due to their Romanovs' relatives' failed attempt to save the imperial family, the Soviets had decided to sentence them to death. Nicholas stuttered in disbelief while the rest of the room began shouting in horror. Yurovsky then drew his pistol and shot Nicholas in the chest. What followed was a horrifying massacre filled with bullets flying around the room, dust, screams, and smoke. Nicholas died the quickest as the initial barrage was aimed at him. Alexandra was next with a bullet to the head, but what should have taken seconds evolved into a 20-minute frenzy of violence. The women and Alexei had all sewn family jewels into their undergarments, which deflected many of the bullets, acting as bulletproof vests and prolonging their terror and agony. The killers finally resorted to ferocious bayoneting attempts, foiled again by the jewels, stabbing, and shots to the head before the screaming in the room was finally silenced. After the dust had settled, the 11 corpses were flung into the back of a Fiat truck and taken to the Four Brothers mine. The bodies were then stripped naked, their clothes burned, and 17 pounds of jewels were handed over to Moscow. The family and their servants were then dumped into a mine shaft and then doused in acid. It was quickly decided that the shaft was too shallow, and Yurovsky returned to the mine on July 19th, deciding to burn 2 bodies and pour more acid on the others so no one would ever know what had happened. They were then buried in shallow graves in the Koptyaki forest near a place called Piglet's Ravine, 9 miles outside Ekaterinburg, and the men who carried out these atrocities were ordered to never speak of what had taken place. This is where the Romanovs would lay, waiting to be discovered for over 60 years. Once word of this massacre began to spread, the Bolshevik government took credit for Nicholas's death, but maintained a position that they had no part in the demise of Alexandra or any of her children. This web of disinformation spread, fueling fires on many conspiracies. Most famously, Anna Anderson, who claimed to be Anastasia, the youngest Romanov daughter, in Berlin, 1920. These claims only aided in diverting attention away from the real questions regarding the true fate of the family, but some never gave up trying to find answers. Ekaterinburg fell to the anti-communist White Army on July 25, 1918, just days after the Romanov family was murdered. After this, the Sokolov Commission was established to investigate the murder, led by its namesake, Nikolai Sokolov. In 1919, he discovered a large number of the Romanovs' belongings around the mine shaft where the bodies were initially buried, such as bone fragments, congealed fat, dentures from Dr. Botkin, corset stays, insignias, keys, pearls and diamonds, bullets, and part of a severed female finger. The remains of Anastasia's dog, a King Charles Spaniel named Jimmy, was also found in the shaft. Sokolov wasn't able to find the secondary burial site, but he did photograph where the Fiat truck had broken down. Alas, his efforts were forced to come to an end in July 1919 when the Bolsheviks came back into the area, but not without a box of artifacts that he was able to recover. Over the rest of his lifetime, Sokolov accumulated 8 volumes of photographic and eyewitness accounts, never ceasing his hunt for the family. Unfortunately, he died of a heart attack in 1924, and it would be decades before others would pick up the mantle and continue his quest. In 1979, 2 amateur historians, one a geologist named Alexander Avdonin, and the other a writer and filmmaker, Gely Ryabov, began looking for the resting place of the Romanovs. According to information they obtained from Yurovsky's son, a primary document with photographs called the Yurovsky Note, the bodies were buried at the location where the truck that was transporting the bodies had broken down that fateful night, near grade crossing 184 on the Koptyaki Road. Pots of acid had been smashed into the pit, as we know, and then railroad ties were placed over the pit before it was covered in earth. In May of 1979, Avdonin and Ryabov began digging at the site. They found the rotted wood of the railroad ties. While their digging did upset the context for future archaeological work, without them, the Imperial Family and those that died with them might never have been found. The 2 dug further and discovered heavily degraded bone and tooth fragments, including several skulls, which the pair kept and later reburied elsewhere. Of course, reporting such a find under a repressive Soviet government was dangerous for them, so they reburied all of the bones. Turns out the KGB knew about the site all along because they had Yurovsky's original report. And no one wants to mess with the KGB. But in 1989, when things began to slacken, Ryabov brought the story to the Moscow News. In 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of communist rule in Russia, 12 years after they first found the remains, an investigation was launched by the Russian government. They sent in a team of archaeologists to excavate the area, and Avdonin's report was proven correct. Now, I will say that the reports I've seen say they didn't quite adhere to professional archaeological standards, even for the 90s. For example, bulldozers were involved. Now, I have been on an archaeological site where a bulldozer was being used. It is a common construction tool, so it's probably on a lot of commercial archaeological sites. But that was for a very specific purpose. They're all used for a specific purpose, and it's not done lightly. When you have someone who had already found the site of the burial, I personally don't see the need for such heavy machinery, especially for heavily damaged bone. But hey, I wasn't even born yet, so I don't really have a say in the matter anyway. There were professional archaeologists on site, though. I do need to point that out. Even then, the entire excavation was done quite hastily, and I'm sure so much evidence was either destroyed or not cataloged properly. In this burial, 9 bodies were found in total. While the bones were badly damaged and no clothing remained to help in identification, modern developments in DNA meant that scientists could indeed get to work on determining if these were in fact the remains of the Imperial Family. To help add more expertise and insight into how this was done, I've invited Rachel from Inside Archaeology, an osteologist by training, to give us a deep dive into what happened next.
Hi Raven, thanks for inviting me onto your channel. I've been fascinated with the Romanovs since I was a little girl, so I'm very happy to join you today to talk about this topic. As Raven said, the investigators first used DNA testing to identify that there were 9 people in the mass grave, and of that, 2 of the skeletons were the parents of another 3. The other 4 skeletons were not related, and it's been long suspected that they belonged to the 4 servants buried along with the royal family. Once the number of individuals present was established, the next step was to try and positively identify them. While in modern day, the use of DNA to identify the skeletal remains of an individual is a relatively common practice, especially in archaeology, this was only done for the first time in 1984, just a few years after the Romanov remains were found. So it was a very new science and technique that was still being figured out. It wasn't until 1992 that Russian scientist Pavel Ivanov was able to put together a team to study the mass grave remains using DNA profiling techniques. This was a groundbreaking study in more ways than one. Until then, DNA hadn't been tested on remains as old as these ones, which were over 70 years by this point. And the researchers didn't know how hard it would be to extract the DNA, or if indeed there would be any left. Contamination of the material was also a concern, as the bones had been handled by numerous people since they had been found. To tackle this, the team gently sanded the surfaces of the bone to remove modern contamination and then took their samples. As expected, they only found very small amounts of DNA. Each sample contained DNA originating from just 6 cells. Luckily for us, this was enough for the testing. In order to identify the bone's owners, mitochondrial DNA was used. This is a type of DNA that is exclusively passed on by mothers. For women, that means they have the same mitochondrial DNA as their mother, grandmother, so on and so forth. Males also inherit the maternal mitochondrial DNA, but do not pass it on to their offspring. This makes it ideal for this type of analysis, but it means that in order to identify an owner, you need to compare it to that of a verified maternal relative. This is why it would be virtually impossible to 100% identify the remains of certain historical figures like Cleopatra through these methods. We just don't have living relatives to compare their potential DNA with. Luckily, it's not the case here, as Alexandra and Nicholas both came from large families with living descendants. For the suspected remains of the Empress, finding a match was relatively easy. Prince Philip, Prince Consort of Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom, agreed to give a sample for the study. Not only was he a direct descendant of the Tsarina Alexandra's mother, Alice, but he is also related to the Romanovs through all 4 of his grandparents. The DNA test was conclusive. The Empress's mitochondrial DNA matched Prince Philip. That allowed the team to say that Alexandra and 3 of her daughters were indeed buried in the mass grave. But what about the remains of the Tsar? The search for his living relatives was slightly more complicated. His nephew was living in Toronto, but he refused to cooperate with the study. Eventually, 2 distant relatives were found. One was his great-niece, and the other was the Duke of Fife in Scotland, a descendant of Nicholas's maternal aunt. Both agreed to provide DNA samples. The Duke and the great-niece matched each other when tested 100%, but when compared to the remains of Nicholas, it came back as only a 98.5% match. What did this mean? Investigators turned to the remains of the Tsar's brother George, who died before the revolution and had been interred in the Imperial crypt, and extracted a DNA sample from his remains. George also had the same DNA results as Nicholas, which confirmed the skeleton in the mass grave was indeed that of the last Tsar of Russia. It's now thought that the imperfect match is a result of a gene mutation that Nicholas's mother, Maria Feodorovna, passed on to her children, but only for 1 or 2 generations. And you remember that uncooperative nephew? In 1993, he ended up in hospital and eventually passed away. At the time, samples of his blood were kept and were later examined, revealing a 100% match between him and Tsar Nicholas. DNA also allowed us to lay to rest the claims of Anna Anderson of being Anastasia. While Anderson had died in 1984, before the tests were done and just when DNA testing was being invented, a hospital had kept a tissue sample from bowel surgery she'd had in the late 1970s. When the mass grave was found, the hospital gave researchers the tissue sample so they could determine whether Anderson was telling the truth. The mitochondrial DNA test proved Anderson was a fraud. She was not a Romanov. Instead, her DNA matched with that of a Polish family. But the question remained. The test had only found 5 of 7 royal family members. Where were the missing 2? To answer this, we go back to you, Raven.
Despite this amazing find, 2 members were still missing: Tsarevich Alexei and either Maria or Anastasia. These were the 2 bodies that Yarovsky separated in order to cover his tracks. Even though this separation was documented, rumors of the 2 potentially escaping their fate reignited, but it was in vain. 2 more investigations were launched in the area in September and October of 1998 and in June of 1999. These were carried out at Ganina Yama, a pit in the Four Brothers mine. These investigations were done much more archaeologically than the first exhumation, but unfortunately nothing was found. A third search was carried out in July of 2004 in the northern part of the Piglets Ravine, where the other 9 bodies were found. Here, ground-penetrating radar was used, as well as some good old troweling and shoveling to bring the soil down to the level it was in 1918. Again, nothing came from this investigation. It wasn't until July of 2007 when Sergei Plotnikov, a 46-year-old builder who was part of an amateur history group that spent free weekends looking for the lost Romanovs, stumbled upon a small hollow covered with nettles. While he was searching this clearing, he hit something hard. He and his friend Leonid began to dig, exhuming several bone fragments in their process. The pair shouted over to the archaeologist that was with them, and they began a proper search. The bones were badly damaged like the rest, but these had also been burned with fire. It was clear that whoever these people were, they did not die peacefully. They were buried only 70 meters away from the first gravesite. Alongside 44 bone fragments, the archaeological team found fragments of Japanese ceramic bottles that were used to carry sulfuric acid, 7 teeth, 3 bullets, a fragment of clothing, and a wire from a wooden box. Archaeologists confirmed that the remains were of a 10 to 13-year-old boy and an 18 to 23-year-old woman. Presumably, Tsarevich Alexei, who was weeks away from his 14th birthday, and Grand Duchess Maria, who was 19 when the murders occurred. The female could also have potentially been Anastasia, who was 17. Now, you might ask, if they were buried so close to the other bodies, how were they not found in other investigations? The answer, like a lot of archaeology, is pure chance. In fact, another team had already dug at that same spot. In the 90s, most of the site was excavated, but when the dig ran out of funding, an 8-meter square area of land, the size of a soccer field, was left unexamined. And it was on this plot where the new team found the bodies. It's definitely one of those moments where if you were the archaeologist in the 90s who missed that spot, you'd really be kicking yourself. Prosecutors reopened the investigation into the deaths of the Romanovs in April of 2008. DNA tests performed by Dr. Anthony Falsetti and the US Army DNA Laboratory proved that the remains found by Plotnikov belonged to 2 children of Tsar Nicholas II, Alexei and a daughter. Plotnikov had finally reunited the Romanov family, simultaneously laying to rest all theories of a miraculous escape or surviving child and debunking every imposter that had come out of the woodwork over the years. After the remains of the Tsar, his wife, 3 of his daughters, and their servants were exhumed in 1991, they remained in laboratories until the debate was settled as to where they should properly be laid to rest. It was finally settled in 1998, and on July 17th, 80 years to the day after being brutally murdered, the remains were transferred from Ekaterinburg to St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, escorted by a formal military honor guard. All 9 people were interred in a special chapel there, and a formal funeral was held, attended by many living relatives and officials from around the world. Alas, the entire family is still not together at rest. The remains of Alexei and Maria, or Anastasia, are still held in the Russian state archives. In 2000, the Romanovs and their 4 servants were canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church for their, quote, humbleness, patience, and meekness during their imprisonment and execution, and declared passion bearers, though they are most popularly referred to as martyrs. Despite their burial and canonization, and not to mention the already extensive testing, the church insisted that Nicholas and Alexandra be exhumed again in 2015 for additional testing, thanks to a very small but very vocal number of scientists who had cast doubts on the results. Thankfully, the additional DNA testing did confirm that the bones belonged to the couple, and hopefully they can finally rest. As for Ipatiev House, the last place the Imperial Family would ever see, it eventually became a branch of the Ural Revolution Museum before becoming a school and then an anti-religious museum in 1938. The house was then taken over by the local Communist Party in 1946 and was listed as a historical revolutionary monument in 1974. But the longer it was standing, the more attention it began to garner as a pilgrimage site for those who wanted to pay their respects to the Imperial Family. As the 60th anniversary of the Russian Revolution approached, Ipatiev House was stripped of its historical significance and was demolished on September 22, 1977. The operation was overseen by future President Boris Yeltsin. The land was then gifted to the church in 1990, and in the year 2000, construction began on the Church of the Blood, now one of Russia's largest churches. In remembrance, an Orthodox cross hangs on a wall, commemorating the exact spot where the Romanov family, Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Kharitonov, and Alexei Trupp were executed. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and special thank you to Rachel from Inside Archaeology for appearing on this channel and providing her expertise on this topic. Be sure to subscribe to Rachel's channel. It's Inside Archaeology. There's a link in my description for you. If you like that video, you know what to do. Smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, do all the things. Big thank you to all of my patrons over on Patreon. If you like the channel and you want to help support the channel and get early access to all of these videos, head on over to Patreon and become a patron. Let me know if there are any other cold cases in archaeology that you would like me to delve into. I really enjoyed this one, mostly because I was obsessed with Anastasia, the film, the DreamWorks film back in the 90s. It became my entire personality, and I was also convinced that I was going to solve the mystery of the Romanovs. And as always, stay dirty, my friends.